Matthew chapter 25.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus then continued to tell his disciples, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at his left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, 'Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me.' Then the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? When was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? When was it that we saw you were sick or in prison and we visited you?' And the king will answer them, 'Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me.' Then he will say to those at his left hand, 'You that are accursed, depart from me into eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not give me clothing. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me.' Then they also will answer, 'Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry, or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not take care of you?' Then he will answer them, 'Truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life.'" The Gospel of our Lord.
Praise to you, Lord.
Please be seated. Today is Christ the King Sunday. That means it's the last Sunday in the church calendar year, and it's the day that we normally celebrate Christ as King. Our gospel reading for today is a parable, and it's one of three parables that we've been examining over the last 3 weeks. Jesus was with his disciples and extended followers, and it's the last week of his life, and these are some of the snippets of conversations Jesus had with them in between Palm Sunday and when he gets betrayed at the Last Supper. Now, in order to understand all three of these parables, we have to continue to take all three of them together because they form one continuous story. The first one we looked at 2 weeks ago, and that was the parable of the bridesmaids. And in that, you remember, there were 10 bridesmaids, and 5 of them were prepared for the wedding, and 5 of them were not. The 5 who were prepared got to go in right away. The 5 who were not had to go and get some stuff, and they showed up late. However, the main point of this parable was, when they knocked on the door, the groom came and said, "Hey, I don't know who you are." And the truth Jesus was trying to get across to the disciples was, it's the people Jesus knows, they're the ones that get to go to heaven. It doesn't matter if you're prepared or not, on time or not. You got to know the groom. And in the second parable, which was last week, we had 3 slaves that were given an enormous sum of money by their master, millions of dollars, to take care of, and the master went away and came back several years later. The first 2 slaves were granted tremendous thanks and gratitude and said, "Come and enter into my joy." The last one wasn't. The last one was left out. And the reason being was because that last slave had a very distorted image of the master, of who God was. Because of that, it undermined his entire relationship with God. He didn't have a relationship with the master because he didn't know the master. And after we read that, we asked the question, okay, so you got to know the master, you got to know Jesus to get into heaven. And so many people have distorted images of who Jesus really is. Well, how do I get to know Jesus? Well, here comes the third parable that explains, this is how you get to know God. This is how you get to know Jesus. And the last parable is the one we read today, and it's about the sheep and the goats. And again, a parable is an illustration. It's not a theological point. It's a story that's meant to get a point across. And so to understand it, we have to look at it in context, the conversation, and who the audience is, trying to figure out what is the point that Jesus is getting across. And just like in the first parable, he wanted to let people know you got to know Jesus if you want to get into heaven. In the second parable, be careful, because most people have very distorted images of God. The third one is how do we then meet God? Well, it's kind of simple, according to Jesus. See, there are two types of people in this world. Those who go and see, those who are disenfranchised, those who have no voice, those who have been rejected by society, those who are left alone. If you go and serve them, take care of them, then you will meet God, because God is present with those people. And if you ignore those people, and you're not with them, and note, it is the sick, it's the naked, it's the people who are in prison, it's criminals, it's people who are homeless, it's people who are hungry. If you are not taking care of them, then you're not going to be meeting God. And each of these three parables of the last week all end with some people being left in eternal torment because they didn't know Jesus. They distorted images of Jesus. They thought they knew the groom, but they didn't. And so here we have this illustration. And again, it's not a theological point. We don't have to worry about getting to heaven and all of a sudden Jesus determining based on some chart that we're not made aware of whether or not we served enough homeless people in order to get into heaven. That's not how it works. We know that Jesus died for us. We know that Jesus made us righteous. So in the last line when it says the righteous get to go into heaven, we know that's us because we were made righteous, not because of what we do, but because of who Jesus was. So this parable isn't about who's getting into heaven. It's about how we get to know who God really is. Those who serve, the people who have been rejected by society, who are unfortunate, those are the people who get to meet God. Those are the people who get to understand who God is. So you can ask the question, how is it? What's so special about that? Well, the first thing we have to realize is that from this parable, we understand that God shows up in the most least expected places. We tend to think that God, if you want to go meet God, you go to church, you go to the home of someone who is rich and famous or successful, because obviously they're being blessed by God, and that's where you'll find God. And this parable turns that upside down. In fact, Matthew, throughout his entire gospel, is saying, no, that's not true. From the very beginning, remember with the Beatitudes, who are the blessed? Not the rich and powerful, it's not the successful. It's those who are mourning, those who are persecuted, those who are hungry. Those are the blessed. Why? Because God's presence is with them. So this is a common theme all throughout Matthew's entire gospel. God shows up in the least likely places, the places we don't expect. That's why we need to go there. God shows up in prisons, in homeless shelters, in bars, in seedy places, in the lives of those people who are undesirable in society. That's where God is. If we want to meet God, spend God, time with God, understand who God is, that's where we need to go. So often, we are reserved. We build up walls between us and those types of places and people. And we think, well, God's going to come and God will visit me and I know God. But so often we're fooling ourselves into thinking that we really know God because our source for finding out who is God is based on multimedia. It's based on the news reports. It's based on the stereotypes that we learn from our neighbors. So going to where God is important. Now, you might say that isn't God everywhere? Of course God is everywhere. So why is it that I have to go to these places and do these things in order to meet God? Well, it seems to me that there are places where it makes it easiest to connect to God. Yes, God is always with us. But we have masks and we build barriers between us and God, and it becomes difficult for us to connect to God. And so Jesus seems to be saying, hey, you have all your religious practices and you have your lives and your well-structured everything, but it doesn't help you to connect to God. So let me tell you, if you want to meet God, if you want to connect to God, if you want to serve God, this is what you got to do. You got to go to these places and connect to these people. The people who are considered undesirable, seedy, rejected, needy. Because when you go there, that's when you connect to God. How is it that you connect easier to God in those kinds of places? Well, there are three things that come out of this I can think of. One is this. When we go there, when we're serving these people in these places, we are bringing hope to people who have lost hope. And apparently when we are in the business of bringing hope to people, we start to understand where hope really lies. It helps us change our perspective. and to stop putting our hope in our own accomplishments, in our own money, in our own lives, in our own decision-making prowess, in our own talents, and instead, it continues to remind us we place our hope in God. And we need that reminder, because if we aren't continuing to remind ourselves and being about the business of bringing hope to people's lives, we put our hope in the wrong places. The second is this. When we go and we serve God in these forms and in these places, we see the vulnerable, and we ourselves allow ourselves for a moment to be vulnerable as well. Author Brene Brown says, we structure our lives in such a way that we have fewer and fewer connections, real connections with people, than we ever did before. We live scripted lives, scripted relationships. Each of our relationships is structured and scripted. This is how it's going to be. And because of that, we have masks. We have barriers. We play roles. And we're very rarely open and honest. And the real part of us is very rarely shown in public. But when we go and we encounter the vulnerability of other people, it helps us to be vulnerable for just a little moment. And when we are vulnerable, when we put ourselves in vulnerable positions, what happens is the love and healing of God is able to touch the inner parts of our lives. The normal way we lead our lives, we don't allow God's love. We know this. We know God loves us, but we hide from God, just like Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. We continue to hide from God behind masks, behind lives that we structure and script and live out in such a way that we think it's pleasing to God, so everything's okay. The real broken parts of us, we hide. We don't allow anybody else to see, especially the sinful parts of who we are. So by going and serving those in need, we are bringing hope to them, hope to ourselves. We are also allowing ourselves to be vulnerable just for a moment. Sometimes that vulnerability that we experience just for a moment, that's all that God needs. That God's love and healing can seep in and touch the very, very inner parts of our lives that we keep hidden, that desperately need healing from God. And the last part is this. Both those who are sheep and those who are goats in this story are utterly surprised at what Jesus says, what God says in this parable. When did we help the poor? God, when did we help feed the hungry? When did we clothe those who are naked? When did that happen, God? Well, when you did it to the least of my members of my family, when you did the least of all of these people. And then the goats are like, well, when did we didn't do that, God? Well, when you didn't do it. Both sides were utterly shocked and surprised. God tells them, when you serve them, you serve me. When you encounter them, you encounter me. And the problem that we often have is that we don't want to see those people who are naked. We don't want to meet those people who are in prison. We don't want to encounter beggars on the street. We don't want to have to do things that bring our lives up against those types of people. We do that because it makes us feel uncomfortable. And so we blind ourselves. We teach ourselves to lead our lives so that we don't have to see the suffering of other people. And God seems to be telling us, you need to see. You need to be able to notice and see those people. Because when you do, you'll begin to have compassion. You'll begin to have the kind of heart that I have. And when you learn to see the suffering around you, then you're going to learn to see me and how God is moving. That's what God's telling us. We blind ourselves to the suffering of others. We don't see it. We ignore it. We lead our lives and pretend that it doesn't exist. And because we do, we are blinding ourselves to being able to see and sense and understand how God is moving. So there's all three of those things that help us when we do these things to connect to God in a powerful way. We're in the business of bringing hope. And when we bring hope to others, we realign how we place, where we place our hope. And when we serve other people like this, we make ourselves vulnerable, even for a moment. And that allows God's love to seep into the inner parts of our lives. And the last thing is that we're training ourselves to see those who are disenfranchised, those who do not have a voice, those who are suffering around us. And when we learn to see those people as real people, we learn to begin to see God's presence in our lives. All three of those things help us to connect to God. And so Jesus seems to be telling his disciples, hey, this is what you need to do in order to really meet me, to get a real true glimpse of who I am, of who God is. And that's so important. Today is Christ the King Sunday. It's the Sunday when we celebrate Christ as King. But we celebrate not by acknowledging that God lives in a grand palace filled with riches and glorious angels who are always singing around him. No. God is amidst the poor, the suffering, those who are in prison, those who are naked on the street, those who have nothing. That's where God lives. If we really want to know God, to experience God, to be changed by God, then that's where we need to live, to be as well. Amen? Our takeaways for today: God regularly shows up in the least likely expected places. If you want to experience God, go to the place where you don't think he's going to be. The seedy places, the undesirable places. That's where God will be. The second one, serving the people of God. Go back one. Serving the people that society rejects does two things for us. First one is this. Three things for us, actually. First one is this. Go to the next slide. God regularly, next slide. Forward. There we go. Breaks down barriers that prevent us and them from experiencing God's hope. Next one. Allows us to be vulnerable, stripping away our masks so God's love and healing can touch our inner lives. And the last one is that it helps us develop a compassionate heart that allows us to see people for who they are as well as to see God. Let's stand for our song of the day.